Donald Trump saluted a royal guard, expecting a show of respect, but he didn't get one. The guard didn't move, didn't blink, and especially didn't salute back. Trump didn't take it well and said, "Figures, you left your own behind in Kabul too." That's when the royal guard broke protocol and exposed exactly what had happened in Kabul that day. Want to know how it all unfolded? First, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, especially if you're in the UK or US. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. You know that particular kind of London morning where the sky can't decide what it wants to be? Grey clouds hanging low like they're considering rain, but can't quite commit to it. And there's just enough chill in the air to make you glad you brought a jacket. That's exactly what greeted the handful of tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace on what was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday. The palace hadn't planned for a media day. Hell, they'd barely planned for a visit at all. But when Donald Trump's people called the Ministry of Defense the night before, announcing he'd be dropping by for a courtesy visit, well, you don't exactly tell a former US president to reschedule. What they'd really wanted, though nobody said it outright, was the photo op, the handshakes, the salutes, the kind of footage that plays well on cable news and social media feeds. So there they were, scrambling to assemble a minimal guard detail with less than 12 hours' notice. No fanfare, no ceremony, just presence. Just the kind of quiet dignity that makes Buckingham Palace what it is. Lance Corporal Callum Fraser stood second from the right at the main gate, his crimson tunic pressed sharp enough to cut glass. 26 years old, clean-shaven, jaw set, with that particular kind of stillness that only comes from serious military training. His tall bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned despite the morning breeze, and beneath its shadow, his eyes held that 1,000-yard stare that tourists always tried to break with silly faces and loud comments. Fraser had stood guard here dozens of times before, for genuine heads of state, for ceremonial processionals, for the kind of diplomatic visits where protocol mattered and respect was earned, not demanded. But this morning felt different. This morning, he was about to stand still for a man he would never, could never salute. At precisely 11:06 a.m., the convoy of black Range Rovers swept through the palace gates like they owned the place. Tinted windows darker than sunglasses, that unmistakable air of American diplomatic authority, and enough security personnel to make you wonder who exactly they thought they were protecting him from. Trump stepped out of the second vehicle with all the subtlety of a campaign rally entrance. Chest puffed, chin lifted, scanning the courtyard like he was mentally calculating real estate values. Behind him trailed the usual entourage, aides with nervous smiles, a handheld camera crew trying to look official, and two PR staffers dressed like they were auditioning for a spy movie. He stopped halfway across the gravel courtyard, took one look at the guards positioned at precise intervals along the palace perimeter, and let out a dismissive snort. "Bit theatrical, isn't it?" he announced, loud enough for his team to hear every word. "All this standing around in costumes, you'd think they'd have modernized by now." His voice carried that particular quality of someone who'd never learned the difference between being heard and being listened to. Captain Fiona Harland, standing nearby in her MOD dress uniform, kept her expression neutral and her eyes forward. She'd dealt with difficult visitors before, but something about this one's casual disrespect for centuries of tradition made her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Fraser didn't react, not yet. But the morning was young, and the real show hadn't even started. Trump didn't walk across that courtyard. He swaggered. Every step carried the weight of someone who'd spent his entire life expecting doors to open and people to step aside. To the tourists pressed against the iron gates, phones already rising to capture whatever was about to happen. It probably looked like just another celebrity moment. But inside that secure perimeter, every uniformed officer could feel the temperature changing. "Look at this setup," Trump muttered to one of his aides, gesturing broadly at the palace facade. "Tremendous architecture, don't get me wrong, but imagine what you could do with this space if you weren't stuck in the past. Golf course in the back garden, maybe some modern security instead of guys in Halloween costumes." The aide managed a weak chuckle, the kind of sound people make when they know they're supposed to laugh but can't quite figure out why. As Trump approached the line of royal guards, he made a show of examining each one like they were museum pieces. "These boys still mourning the empire," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "All this silence. It's like a funeral for colonial pride." More forced laughter from his entourage, the kind that echoed hollowly against the ancient stones. Captain Harlan's mouth tightened at the corners, but her professional composure never wavered. Behind the palace gates, a few tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even they could sense that something about this felt wrong. Trump paused in front of the first guard, leaning in with exaggerated curiosity. "I was told not to touch them. Something about sacred duty and centuries of tradition, right?" He chuckled, the sound sharp against the morning air. "But you'd think they'd at least acknowledge someone who knows what real leadership looks like." The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every moment for whatever news cycle would digest it later. But the guards remained perfectly still, unmoved by the performance unfolding in front of them. Trump moved to the second guard, a younger trooper, whose face remained as impassive as carved marble. "Any of you even blink? Or is that against regulations too?" Still nothing. The wall of red and black might as well have been part of the palace architecture itself. And then Trump reached Fraser. Something made him pause. Something in the way this particular guard held himself. Not like someone playing a role, but like someone who'd earned the right to wear that uniform through something harder than standing still for tourists. Trump studied Fraser's face for a long moment, his expression shifting from casual mockery to something that might have been genuine curiosity. "What's your story then?" he said, voice dropping lower, but still audible to the growing crowd. "You look like someone who's actually seen some dirt, but I guess now you just stand here like a museum piece, right?" Fraser's eyes remained fixed on that distant point that guards are trained to focus on. If Trump's words had any effect on him, there was no outward sign of it. But Trump wasn't finished. He never was. "You know what the problem is with old traditions," he announced, turning slightly to address both his team and the gathered onlookers. "They protect statues more than they protect soldiers." It was a deliberate provocation, delivered with that trademark smirk that suggested he was just getting started. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop a few degrees, and even the tourists outside the gates had stopped taking selfies to watch whatever was unfolding. Fraser remained perfectly still. But if you knew what to look for, if you understood the subtle signs of a soldier under pressure, you might have noticed the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. And Trump, with the instincts of a predator who'd spent his life finding people's weak spots, noticed it too. Trump began to circle in front of Fraser, like he was inspecting a piece of equipment that might be defective. The kind of slow, deliberate movement designed to unnerve, to provoke, to establish dominance through proximity alone. "You know," he began, brushing an imaginary speck of dust off his navy blazer, "I've been to military parades all over the world, some of the best you've ever seen, tremendous displays of real power, but you Brits—" He shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "You really take the cake with this mannequin act." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Back when I was Commander-in-Chief, we were the ones doing the real work. Afghanistan, Syria, dealing with actual threats while your people were, what, making sure their buttons were polished?" Captain Harlan's fingers twitched behind her back, but she maintained her position. The other guards remained motionless, though something in the air around them had shifted. Even the tourists could feel it, that electric tension that builds just before a storm breaks. Trump stepped closer to Fraser, clearly enjoying the silence he was filling with his voice. "You want to know who really ran that evacuation in Kabul? We did. The United States. Not Britain. Not NATO. Certainly not guys like you standing around in red coats." Fraser didn't blink, didn't twitch. But there was something in his stillness now that wasn't just ceremonial discipline. It was control, the kind that takes enormous effort to maintain. "While you people were busy with your protocols and your tea breaks," Trump continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "American soldiers were pulling your contractors out of the fire, cleaning up the mess your side couldn't handle." He let the words hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The insult was deliberate, calculated, designed to get under the skin of anyone who'd served. But Fraser's expression remained as unreadable as carved stone. Trump noticed the lack of reaction and leaned in closer, lowering his voice to something more intimate, but still audible to those nearby. That hit a nerve, huh? He said with satisfaction. We lost good Americans, saving British civilians because your people couldn't get their paperwork sorted fast enough. For the first time since Trump had arrived, Fraser's jaw tightened visibly, just slightly, just enough for someone watching closely to notice that the words were landing exactly where they were aimed. And Trump, with the instincts of someone who'd built a career on finding pressure points, saw it immediately. You should be thanking us, he said flatly, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Instead, you just stand there pretending you're above it all. But I've read the after-action reports. Your people abandoned their own medics at that airport. Absolutely disgraceful. Captain Harland shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. She was still maintaining protocol, but every muscle in her body had gone tense. Around the courtyard, the other officers were standing straighter, their professional composure masking what was clearly growing anger. Trump straightened up and turned toward the cameras his team had discreetly positioned for maximum coverage. Maybe if they'd spent less time standing like statues and more time fighting like soldiers, we wouldn't have lost so many good men cleaning up their mess. The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Even the tourists outside the gates seemed to recoil, sensing that they'd just witnessed something that crossed a line they didn't fully understand. Fraser still didn't speak, but his silence had transformed from ceremonial discipline into something else entirely, something that hummed with barely contained energy. Because what Trump didn't know, what none of his handlers had bothered to research, was that Callum Fraser hadn't just read about Kabul in after-action reports. He had been there, he had stood at that gate, he had watched people die, and he remembered exactly who had been left behind. The courtyard had gone dead quiet. Not the ceremonial kind of quiet that usually surrounded the royal guards, but the heavy, oppressive silence that falls just before something breaks. Even Trump's team seemed to sense it, shifting uncomfortably as they watched their boss push whatever boundary he was testing. Trump straightened his spine with theatrical precision, squaring his shoulders as he glanced toward the cameras. The gesture was practiced, presidential, designed for maximum impact. He turned back to Fraser with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Well," he announced, his voice rising just enough to carry across the entire courtyard, "let's give them something worth filming." And with that, he raised his right hand in a deliberate, exaggerated salute. Not the kind offered between military professionals as a mark of respect, but the kind performed for an audience. A prop in whatever narrative he was trying to construct. He held it there, stiff and theatrical, eyes locked on Fraser's face like he was waiting for applause that would never come. The world seemed to hold its breath. Fraser didn't move, not a muscle, not even a blink. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and for a moment it felt like the entire palace was balanced on the edge of that stillness. Trump held the salute longer than any genuine gesture would require. Long enough for the photographers to get their shots, long enough to make the moment feel forced and uncomfortable. Then he lowered his arms slowly, his lips pursing in mock disappointment. "Rude," he muttered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "I saluted you, soldier. That's called respect. Maybe look it up sometime." Fraser remained motionless, his gaze fixed on that distant point that guards are trained to focus on. But something in his stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was active resistance in its purest form. Trump took a step closer, close enough now that only inches separated them. His voice dropped into a low, acidic whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard. "Must be loyalty to that old woman with the crown. Or maybe it's just cowardice dressed up in red." The insult landed like a slap across the entire guard detail. Behind Trump, even his most sycophantic aides shifted uncomfortably. This had gone beyond political theatre into something darker, more personal. But Trump wasn't finished. He never was. He turned slightly, addressing both the guards and the growing crowd of onlookers who had pressed themselves against the palace gates to witness whatever was unfolding. "Here's the thing about your precious tradition," he announced, his voice carrying across the ancient stones. You wear these fancy uniforms, carry these rifles, but what do you actually protect? Ghosts? Statues? You can't even move without permission from some dusty old rule book. Then, back to Fraser, his eyes narrowing with predatory focus. I could say anything to you right now, couldn't I? And all you do is stand there like a toy soldier, because that's all you are. Decoration for the tourists. But Fraser's silence wasn't submission. Not anymore. It was something far more dangerous. Discipline under extreme pressure, the kind forged in places where holding your position could mean the difference between life and death for the people depending on you. And though his mouth hadn't moved, something in his stare had shifted. Like a fault line under pressure, invisible but undeniable to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Trump could feel it too. That much was obvious from the way he took a half step back. The kind of involuntary movement you make when you realize you've pushed against something that might push back. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar blend of arrogance and irritation that had carried him through decades of confrontations. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Trump's momentary retreat lasted exactly as long as it took him to realize people had noticed it. His jaw tightened, and he stepped forward again with deliberate aggression, closing the distance between himself and Fraser until he was standing closer than any tourist would dare. "You people," he began, his voice louder now, carrying across the courtyard like he was addressing a rally. "Love to talk about duty and honor, real poetic stuff. But let's talk about reality for a minute." He gestured sharply toward Fraser, close enough that his finger nearly touched the guard's crimson tunic. "I know exactly what happened in Kabul. Your commanders were on the radio begging us for air support, while your people ran for the evacuation planes like their hair was on fire." Fraser didn't move, but that subtle tightening around his eyes was back. The only sign that Trump's words were finding their target. British officers literally crying over the comms, asking America to clean up another mess you couldn't handle. Trump's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "We saved your contractors. We pulled out your intelligence assets when your own helicopters wouldn't even fly. And what did we get for it? Blame, criticism, headlines written by cowards in London newsrooms who never heard a shot fired in anger. The insults were landing with surgical precision now, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. Around the courtyard, the other guards maintained their positions, but the tension was building like pressure in a steam boiler. "And you," Trump continued, stepping even closer to Fraser, "standing here in your ridiculous costume, pretending like you can't hear me, you should be the first one to say thank you. Because without America, your people would still be rotting in that desert." Fraser's silence stretched between them like a loaded weapon. But Trump mistook it for weakness, for submission. He couldn't have been more wrong. "I heard about your people," Trump pressed on, his voice thick with satisfaction at finally getting a reaction. "Medics left behind at the gate, local staff abandoned. Some British woman in a hijab crying while your people walked away. You think that's America's fault?" And that was the moment Fraser spoke. "We had a medic." The words cut through the air like a gunshot, low, cold, and absolutely clear. It was the first sound Fraser had made all morning, and it stopped Trump mid-sentence. "Layla Khan, British citizen, NHS-trained trauma surgeon. She'd saved dozens of our people in Helmand province." Fraser's voice was steady, controlled, but underneath it was something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. She wore a Union Jack on her sleeve and a UK identification badge on her chest. Trump blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift. He'd been expecting silence, submission, maybe some stammered excuse. He wasn't prepared for this quiet, devastating precision. "We brought her to that gate ourselves," Fraser continued, his eyes still fixed straight ahead, never looking directly at Trump. "Your security contractors turned her away. Twice. Said she wasn't on the approved list." The courtyard had gone so quiet you could hear the flags snapping in the breeze above the palace walls. She died 20 meters from your checkpoint, shrapnel from a suicide bomber, while your people were loading VIPs onto helicopters and sealing the doors behind them. Trump tried to recover, tried to regain control of the narrative. That's not... We had protocols, security procedures. You can't just... She wasn't some random refugee, Fraser's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. She was one of ours. She'd earned her place at that gate through 3 tours of duty and more saves than I can count. Fraser's chin lifted just slightly, and for the first time since Trump had arrived, he turned his head and looked directly at him. The movement was small, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute moral authority. She died wearing our flag while yours refused to read her identification. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the complete absence of sound, as if the entire world had stopped breathing to listen to what came next. And Donald Trump, for perhaps the first time in his public life, had absolutely nothing to say. The silence afterward was unlike anything that Courtyard had ever held. Not the ceremonial quiet of changing guards or state occasions, but the profound hush that follows a truth so absolute it leaves no room for argument, no space for spin or deflection. Captain Harlan didn't move from her position, but her expression had shifted subtly. Every MOD officer in the courtyard was standing straighter now, their professional composure masking what was clearly deep, righteous anger. Even Trump's team had gone motionless. The camera crew slowly lowered their equipment, suddenly uncertain whether they should be filming this at all. The aide nearest to Trump was staring at the ground, his face flushed with what might have been shame. But Fraser wasn't finished. He didn't shout. He didn't step forward aggressively or abandon his post. He simply stood there, in perfect military bearing, and delivered the kind of quiet devastation that only absolute truth can provide. "I stood at attention while you mocked our traditions," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stone courtyard. "I remained silent while you twisted our history to make yourself look bigger. I held my position while you turned our service into a punchline for your cameras." Trump tried to interject with a weak, "Now wait just a..." But Fraser's voice cut through it like it wasn't even there. "But I will not stand silent while you dishonor the memory of someone who died serving the same mission you abandoned." The words hit with the force of an artillery shell. Every syllable was pronounced with military precision, each one finding its target with devastating accuracy. "Layla Khan wasn't collateral damage in some bureaucratic mix-up," Fraser continued, his gaze never wavering from Trump's face. "She was a British Army medic who saved lives under fire. She earned her evacuation through courage and competence. And your people, following your administration's policies, refused her passage because she didn't look like their idea of what a British soldier should be." Trump's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His usual arsenal of deflections and counterattacks seemed to have deserted him entirely. "You want a salute?" Fraser asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard. "Earn one." And then, just like that, he resumed his original position, shoulders back, chin up, eyes forward. A breathing monument to everything his uniform represented. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. One moment he was a voice of moral authority, delivering judgment. The next, he was simply a royal guard at his post, as still and silent as the stones beneath his feet. Trump stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, blinking like someone who had walked into a room expecting applause and received only the echo of his own footsteps. Captain Harlan finally broke the spell, stepping forward with the kind of calm authority that brooks no argument. "Sir," she said, addressing Trump directly, "your vehicle is waiting." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact that somehow managed to be both perfectly polite and completely final. No one moved to punish Fraser. No one needed to. Because in that moment, surrounded by centuries of tradition and duty, he was the only person in that courtyard who had remembered what the uniform really meant. And every single person present, including Donald Trump, understood that perfectly. Trump stood there a moment longer than dignity should have allowed, his usual confidence seeming to leak out of him like air from a punctured balloon. His aides were already moving with the subtle urgency of people who needed this moment to end as quickly as possible. The camera crew had stopped filming entirely, some of them actively avoiding eye contact with anyone. One technician quietly switched off his equipment's battery pack, the small click sounding unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. Captain Harlan didn't need to repeat herself. Her presence was enough. The kind of quiet authority that doesn't require enforcement because it's already been accepted by everyone involved, including the person being managed. Trump cast one last glance at Fraser, his expression cycling through what might have been confusion, anger, and something that looked almost like recognition, but he didn't speak. For once in his public life, he seemed to understand that words would only make things worse. He turned sharply and began walking back toward the waiting convoy, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stones with a hollow quality that seemed to emphasize how alone he was in that moment. His entourage fell into step behind him, but there was no energy in their movement, no sense of triumph or satisfaction. They looked like people leaving a funeral. As the small procession moved toward the palace gates, Trump reached up to adjust his collar with an irritated gesture, muttering under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Ungrateful little island!" Harland heard it. So did several MOD officers positioned near the archway. But no one responded. They didn't need to. The words hung in the air like the petulant complaint of a child who hadn't gotten his way, and everyone present understood them for exactly what they were. Back at his post, Fraser hadn't moved so much as a millimetre. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point that guards are trained to focus on, his posture immaculate, his breathing steady and controlled. To anyone arriving now, he might appear to have been standing exactly like this for hours, untouched by drama or controversy. But everyone who had witnessed what just transpired knew better. They had seen something that couldn't be captured in a photograph or reduced to a social media clip. They had watched a moment when duty and conscience aligned so perfectly that silence became more powerful than any speech and stillness carried more authority than any gesture. As Trump reached his vehicle, he paused with one hand on the door handle, looking back across the courtyard one final time. The guards remained at their posts, unmoved and unmoving. The palace staff maintained their professional composure. The very stones seemed to radiate the weight of centuries. He ducked into the Range Rover without another word, the door closing with a soft thud that somehow carried the finality of a book being shut. Moments later, the convoy began its departure, tires whispering against gravel as it glided back through the palace gates and disappeared into the London traffic. But in the courtyard, nothing had changed. The tourists remained where they were, many of them still processing what they had witnessed. Some had tears in their eyes, though they might not have been able to explain exactly why. Others simply stood in contemplative silence, understanding that they had been present for something significant, something that would stay with them long after they returned home. The scheduled ceremonies continued their precise choreography. Drums beat their measured rhythm in the distance. Boots marched in perfect unison. The flowing river of red and gold moved forward with all the weight of tradition and duty behind every step. Fraser would maintain his post until the exact moment his relief arrived, then march away with the same flawless precision he had demonstrated throughout this entire ordeal. No acknowledgement of what had transpired, no glances toward the crowd, no suggestion that anything unusual had occurred. He would simply execute his duty and disappear beneath the palace archway, leaving behind a courtyard full of people who would never quite look at courage the same way again. As he eventually vanished from view, the spectators didn't cheer or applaud. They didn't need dramatic gestures or satisfying conclusions. They had witnessed something far more profound than theatre. They had seen what happens when real authority meets manufactured importance. They had learned that the most powerful response to unearned demands isn't always a response at all. They had discovered that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved. And in a world of constant noise and endless performance, they had been reminded that true strength often speaks softest of all. So here's the question that matters. When someone demands respect they haven't earned, do you give it to them anyway? Or do you stand your ground the way Fraser did, holding the line for something bigger than yourself? And maybe more importantly, in our age of instant reactions and viral moments, is there still power in choosing dignity over drama? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story moved you, if it made you think about honor and duty in a new way, smash that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the incredible people who guard these traditions with their lives. And if you know someone who thinks real strength means making the most noise until people pay attention, share this video with them right now. Our next Royal Guard story is waiting on your screen. Click it and dive in. We'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that true authority doesn't demand recognition. It simply stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices in the world discover they have nothing left to say.